Hi and welcome to Like Maria. Today I'm going to be comparing two documentaries. I'm going to be looking at Asif Kapadia's Amy and comparing it with Nick Broomfield's Kurt and Courtney. If you haven't already, you might want to watch my 5 frames from on Amy, or you might want to watch my 5 and 5 video about Nick Broomfield and his techniques. This video is for anyone studying Amy and needing to apply filmmakers' theories to it. So both of these documentaries are about extremely talented musicians who died in tragic circumstances, but the approaches of the filmmakers are completely different. Nick Broomfield is known for the performative mode, for appearing on screen and for giving a direct voiceover of where he's going and what he's doing. We could argue that this creates a more truthful documentary because he's not hiding behind the camera. Asif Kapadia uses archive footage almost entirely. The voiceovers that he uses come from friends and family of Amy, and they feel very truthful because they're quite emotional and they give us a look behind the scenes of Amy's life. But we never hear Kapadia's own voice or his opinions, and so as an audience we're left to interpret what he's trying to tell us ourselves. A voice we do hear from though is Amy herself, through her song lyrics and performance, but also through these home recordings that have been captured in a very observational way. We see Amy as a child and we get a sense of what she was like. We see her growing up, we see her problems with drugs, and eventually we see her death. The whole documentary is centred around Amy, and Amy almost narrates her own story. Now in Kurt and Courtney, Kurt is largely absent from the documentary, and instead of relying on close friends and family like Kapadia does in Amy, Broomfield is left having to talk to Kurt's acquaintances, people that have kind of a loose connection with him, whether that be musically or through the family. There are a few clips of him talking to the camera, there are some photographs of him performing, there's some photographs of him with Courtney Love, but his voice is very rarely heard. There is a moment where we discover something about Kurt as a child, and this is through his Aunt Mary feeding back on his early musical career, and we hear some recordings of Kurt singing songs from the Monkees as a child. Here, the type of footage used by the two documentary makers is completely different. Nick Broomfield is in control of the filming of Aunt Mary, so the mise-en-scène is something he has had control over, and one of the things that we notice is the huge tapestry of the cross, signifying Aunt Mary's religious approach and creating a particular persona for her on screen. He does this again later in the documentary when he's filming Frances Bean's Nanny. The setting is in a basement, there's very little lighting, so the mise-en-scène creates a more sinister atmosphere. So he uses mise-en-scène to really shape the narrative and create these heroic and villainous characters. So here, although the footage is created specifically for the documentary, it feels quite manipulated in a way that the archive footage that Kapadia uses doesn't. So although Kapadia is unable to manipulate the footage itself because he's not filming it, he is able to manipulate it by slowing it down, by freeze framing certain images and combining those with key voiceovers or key lyrics from songs. So even though the mise-en-scène isn't being manipulated, the manipulation is coming through the editing, and editing, I would say, is one of the most powerful technical elements of documentary making. Both filmmakers here have used editing to structure their documentaries in particular ways. Kapadia starts his documentary with footage of Amy as a 14-year-old singing Happy Birthday to her friend Lauren. We as an audience are kind of wowed by her ability, her musical virtuosity. You know, her voice is engaging and soulful and much more than we would expect from a 14-year-old. So we start off with a fairly positive viewpoint, and then we go on this journey sort of documenting Amy's life over a few years before her death. So it's very much a linear narrative that their editing facilitates. Broomfield also takes us on a journey, but starts in a very different way. His documentary starts with archive footage of Kurt Cobain's dead body, and we also hear archived news reports and various different sounds that really build up and overwhelm the audience. We don't see Kurt's talent at this point either, but we are told about it. We're told that he is a god in his own right. So Broomfield's voiceover tells us what to think about Kurt and tells us to sort of respect him as a musician, before it then takes on an investigative tone, where we will spend quite a lot of the documentary travelling around to different places and trying to find people to interview. So both documentaries come at their subject matter from a slightly different position and with a slightly different tone. Amy feels like a celebration of her musical genius, whereas with Kurt, we're already thrown into the tragedy of his death and the mystery surrounding it. What this also allows Broomfield to do is interview various different people, and we get to see his interview technique where he uses his slightly bumbling persona to sort of trip people up and get people to say things that they perhaps wouldn't have said otherwise, which is very powerful, particularly in this scene with Courtney Love's dad. And this is something Kapadia can't do. Kapadia did interview people for the Amy documentary, but he interviewed them without camera equipment. They were recorded like radio interviews, so there was never the intention that Kapadia or his interviewees would appear on screen. By not having his voice and not allowing the audience to hear the questions he asks, he can't probe his interviewees, he can't follow up questions, and he can't subtly direct them to give certain responses. What Broomfield also does though, and this again feels quite manipulative, is he leaves in footage that other documentary makers might take out. So here we've got an image of him visiting the building that was opposite Kurt's home, and there's no real reason for it to be there except to convince us that Broomfield is going on a genuine journey and what we're seeing is truthful, honest footage. So this again raises the question of how truthful these different approaches are. With the Broomfield documentary, he's making it quite clear that he is the author of the documentary. This is a product that he has created. Whereas with Kapadia's approach, he's hidden behind the camera. Undoubtedly, though, there is an agenda in creating the documentary, but he's not necessarily explicit about what that is. However, we could argue that this makes it a much more engaging documentary. We feel like we really get to know Amy, and therefore we have an emotional response and a psychological response to what we see. It's also all about Amy, so we feel like we get an in-depth understanding of her life, and that's not the case with the Broomfield documentary. As he struggles to find out enough information about Kurt, the documentary takes on a slightly different tone and is about sort of freedom of speech and the making of the documentary itself. So although we might have an emotional response to it, we're also going to have a reflexive response where we think about the making of the documentary itself. So again, we could argue this makes it a better documentary because it's engaging the audience in lots of different active ways. Having said all of that, I would argue that the Kapadia documentary is more entertaining. It's a much more slick documentary. It is a documentary that you can enjoy to some extent. Even though it's telling a tragic story, there is an element of enjoyment when it comes to the music, and there's a huge amount of music used in the documentary. Again, unlike the Broomfield one, where he just can't get the rights to Kurt's music. So both of these filmmakers have very different techniques and very different approaches to making documentaries. Undoubtedly, they've both added something to the genre. Broomfield by embracing the performative mode and appearing on screen. Kapadia by embracing use of archive material and creating documentaries that are almost all archive and relying very much on digital technologies in the modern age. Although Broomfield has got a huge body of work, I would argue that Kapadia's trilogy of documentaries about well-known kind of outsiders have been much more commercially successful, taking a large amount of money at the box office and attracting wide audiences. And we could argue that perhaps in Kurt and Courtney, Broomfield's technique of appearing on screen seems a bit dated, and it makes the documentary feel more like it's about himself than it is about Nirvana. We do see a bit of a shift in his later documentaries though, so it's important to remember that. The big similarity though is that both filmmakers have an agenda in making their documentary. And the problem with Kapadia's is that it's less explicit. The slick production, the use of the music, and even the name of the documentary makes it feel really believable and like we're getting a personal insight. But does that mean that we're less likely to question what we're seeing on screen? Ultimately, it doesn't matter what documentary you're watching or who it's by, it's important to have that critical engagement, so you're questioning what you're seeing on screen. Documentaries are trying to persuade us of something. They are trying to convince us to change our opinions. And so we always need to approach them with a critical eye and just question what we're seeing on screen. Okay, that's it for today. I hope you found that useful and that you can now apply Nick Broomfield's ideas to other documentary filmmakers.